Welcome back to the second part of Bottomline Africa tonight. And just a reminder of a Twitter poll. And before we start our discussion, we did ask you earlier, who should bear the greatest responsibility for police brutality in Kenya? Is it the president, the inspector general, or the individual officers themselves? And we're asking this question based on a report that was released today by the Human Rights Watch. And I'm together with Oceano Namwaya from the Human Rights Watch. Good evening, Oceano. Welcome to the program. So let me begin with the report itself, for the sake of our viewers who maybe didn't have a chance to look at this report. What are some of the highlights, perhaps?
The key highlights are that during that period, the second phase of the elections, at least 37 people died. Most of those people were killed by police.
Yes.
We are talking of about 23 people having been killed by police. But the very unique highlight of that report is that we have another 14 people who were killed by armed groups or armed gangs that appeared to be linked to the ruling party. This is a very significant departure from the initial phase of the elections because there was increased gang activity in the second phase.
Yes.
And this report focuses on Nairobi alone. So it does not include what happened in Kisumu, for example, or Homa Bay or Migori or Siaya. And we do know that there's a lot that happened there. Yeah.
So is there another report that perhaps you're planning to release that is going to cover all these other areas apart from Nairobi?
We did quite a bit of it, of those areas for the first phase of the election.
Yes.
And then we did another report for the second phase of the first phase of the election, focusing on Nairobi. That was the joint report we did with Amnesty International in October.
Yes.
However, this tries to look at Nairobi, what happened exactly between September and November.
Now, Oceano, in your report, apparently you've indicated that you've interviewed about 67 people, including 30 relatives of victims, 27 witnesses, aid workers, community leaders. I mean, there are many people asking, what next? What human rights organization perhaps do after releasing this kind of report?
Our expectation is that the government will take note because we do try to get in touch with the authorities, including the police. And the purpose for taking note is to ensure that there are proper investigations that are carried out and that eventually we do begin to see people being taken to court. So that is the main expectation. Because the human rights groups do not actually have the responsibility. The responsibility for investigating this kind of killings does not lie with the human rights groups. The human rights groups only try to point out that there's a violation that happened. The primary responsibility lies with the police.
Lies with the government and the police and by extension the government.
Yeah.
So the main question is, do you really believe the government is going to do proper investigation? Bearing in mind, the president himself, just the other day, was openly congratulating the police for a job well done during the election. So do you think, from the human rights perspective, do you really believe the government is going to perhaps really take care of all these damning allegations in that report?
Actually, we believe that the government has a responsibility to ensure that this happens.
Having a responsibility is one thing, but acting on it is another.
We have a big problem in Kenya of accountability.
Yes. And
we're hoping that eventually the government will begin to see the significance of ensuring that police are not let loose on the population.
Let's talk about IPOA, for example. To what extent are you working with this kind of an organization to put, the police in check?
We do try to reach out to every other agency, including the police at IPOA. So for this particular research, we did reach out to IPOA.
Yeah.
And we gave them a list of the cases that we have. And we did remind them that we are actually going to go out with these cases. They do know that we normally publish these kind of cases. Unfortunately, unlike in the past when IPOA used to respond, for this particular phase of killings, IPOA has not been very responsive. And it is important to note that in most of those cases that we have in the report, the families and the relatives are complaining that they have not seen any significant movement, either within IPOA or within the police itself. We know IPOA picks up the investigations at a certain stage.
Yes.
So the initial preliminary investigations are supposed to be done by police. We normally see the police saying, whenever there's a killing, they say, let IPOA do it. But they have the initial responsibility, for example, for compiling the circumstances, a report on the circumstances of the killing, and then submitting that report to IPOA. One of the things that we did learn while working on this is that police were not cooperating on that. So IPOA, first of all, had difficulties gathering that information. That is partly the reason why IPOA was not able to establish the killers of Baby Pendo and Samantha and Stephanie Mora.
I mean, where will that leave the victims? I mean, if you know, a body like IPOA cannot get the attention of the police, so where will that leave the victims?
I think it's a political question that we are dealing with here. I think we are significantly, increasingly getting to realize that the lack of accountability within the police is partly an internal police question, but it's also a significantly political question that we have to deal with. That's why you see, in some cases, we see some movement, especially where there are isolated cases where people have been killed and there is a public outcry. Then you see police cooperating and IPOA appearing to be moving. But when there's politically sensitive killings like this one, and I'll particularly point out this one, and you remember there's a time we were talking about disappearances and killings in northeastern Kenya and Mombasa. Those politically sensitive cases, we appear to not have anybody that is able to move and investigate, including IPOA. Those are cases that we submitted to IPOA, about 45 cases of disappearances of people, some of who are actually arrested within the police station. And the people who arrested them are known because they had been summoned to a police station by a particular individual, and then they disappeared. And to this day, since 2016, I think we did meet the Inspector General of Police on June 20th, 2016. To this day, there's not a single case that has been investigated.
So these are cases that happened before September, and your report today captured the deaths between September and November last year. So if these are the cases before September have not been, finalized, or justice has not been served to these victims, what makes you believe that the 37 number that you've put in your report today, what makes you believe that justice is going to be served?
Eventually, justice has to be served. You know, this government might not move, or somebody might not want to do something today, but maybe next year somebody might want to do something. So the issue of just documenting and having the records that show that something happened that needs a response from the authorities is there. That record is very, very important.
Let me ask you this question that many people have been asking before. I mean, how strong is IPOA? Are they strong enough to deal with the police force that we have at the moment? Do you think are they getting the support they really need from the government, perhaps?
I think the way IPOA was initially conceptualized, it was supposed to be a very strong body. And it was supposed to be the body that ordinary Kenyans run to whenever they have issues with the police. But the way the IPOA has been managed, the relationship between IPOA and the administration today is a very problematic relationship, in that there's a feeling that IPOA's work is being hampered by the executive. Like there are times when I think they have problems with funding, the funds are not released when they appear to be moving on some sensitive cases, like the case I've mentioned of northeastern Kenya. And then there are cases where the executive threatens them with amendments to the law to reduce their powers. And then there are cases where I've had privately between individual investigators within IPOA where they come under a lot of political pressure when they're pursuing certain cases. So I'm suspecting part of the reason they're unable to respond effectively on this kind of killings during elections and the killings that happened in northeastern Kenya in respect of counter-terrorism or Al-Shabaab is partly political pressure and the feeling that there will be no cooperation from the police and the military, like in the disappearances, the military and the police are involved. So for this one, I don't think the police are willing to cooperate with IPOA.
And speaking about the police, let me focus on your report today. Apparently, you've indicated that most victims were shot and killed at close range. So, I mean, some bullets are from some sophisticated weapons, apparently. What does this say about the discipline of the police? And because they always seem to be in denial.
Yes, you know, there are two issues there that I want to separate.
Yes.
There is an internal police problem, a breakdown of accountability structures within the police, which was identified long time ago, especially in 2007 after the violence, and there was an agreed path for addressing that problem. And the Constitution of 2010 was part of that path. And several other legislations that were passed between 2010 and 2012 were geared towards addressing that problem. Then there is an external problem, which is a political problem. So the political problem has actually gone into affecting the internal, augmenting the internal problem, in the sense that some of the changes that were being introduced between 2010 and 2012 have actually been reversed by the political establishment. You remember the amendments to the National Police Service Act, the amendments to the National Police Service Commission Act, during which I think we saw some of the powers being removed from the National Police Service Commission and being transferred to the executive, to the presidency. We saw the amendments to the National Police Service Commission, National Police Service Act, which was seeking to increase police powers to use firearms, including to protect property. You remember that was 2013 and 2014. Yes. And you remember the Security Laws Amendment Act. There are some that were struck down by the court, but there are some that were actually retained. For example, those laws that allow police to hold you for a period of 90 days. Those laws are there. So it's a conglomeration of political and internal police reluctance itself.
And apparently this is not just a problem that is facing Kenya. Other African countries also in land. For example, we just had a story from Kinshasa, that is the DRC, where the police are being accused of using live firearms to deal with protesters. We're going to talk about that shortly. But from your own observation, apparently this is not the only report. Amnesty International also released a similar report, was it last week? So from your own observation, from your own point of view, how do you rate Kenya as far as complying with globally accepted human rights standard is concerned?
I think it's difficult to rate because a violation anywhere is bad enough. So one person dying and 100 people dying they're all lives that people are losing. Ordinarily, nobody should lose a life under any circumstance. What worries me about Kenya are two things. One is the attempt by the authorities to even justify the killings, and two, the lack of outrage, public outrage when the killings happen, and in some cases we see a section of the public trying to justify killings based on the political inclinations. I think that's very, very worrying. We don't see some of these kind of dynamics in countries like, say, Uganda, for example, where somebody gets killed and you see a section of the population coming out strongly to justify. One of the things I would urge Kenya to try and do is to never justify a single death, whether it is for somebody that you like or somebody that you don't like. Yeah.
What will you say about the blatant, apparently, disregard of the rule of law? Apparently, just the other day, a prominent lawyer, Miguna was deported, or he was forced into exile, and there were apparently 3 court orders, and nobody, they were just brushed aside. So if a prominent lawyer is forced into exile or is deported, I mean, where will that leave the common Mwananchi out there?
I think there were more than 3 orders.
Yes.
And you think, there has been a build-up. And that's why I'm saying one of the things that worries us a lot in Kenya is the lack of public understanding that the rule of law is a responsibility that should never be defended if the government seems to violate the rule of law. What needs to happen is that one, institutions needs to be respected. You remember in 2007, one of the issues that were identified as having led to the violence was the lack of confidence in institutions, partly because the institutions had been disrespected over a long period of time, to the extent that when there was a dispute, say, for example, an election dispute, the opposition was not willing to go to court. And that's what we're beginning to see. If the court issues orders consistently and the authorities disregard the orders, we shall get to a point where there'll be a major dispute which needs to be resolved by the courts, and people will not be willing to go to court. And you can imagine what that means. Yeah.
And Otsedo, let's go continental now before we wrap up the interview. You said there's some sort of uprising in Togo, a lot of demonstrations happening in Kinshasa as well, in Ethiopia just the other day. Apparently the Prime Minister was forced to resign. So in all these cases, there's something common. People demonstrating and police using force. I mean, it seems this is a problem that affects so many African countries.
Sometime last year, we issued what we normally call our world report, and we looked at the human rights trend in the region. And our observation then was that there is a gradual decline of human rights within the countries in the region. And we did point out what is happening in Ethiopia. We did point out what's happening in Uganda. And we did point out what's happening in Kenya here. And even Rwanda, you know, in the only country we didn't talk about at that time was Tanzania. But you know what's happening in Tanzania today? It's probably just as bad as the rest of the other countries in the region. So the decline of the human rights situation in the region is a trend that is actually should worry everyone. Every citizen, every leader, because today you might be a leader, tomorrow